The first time she came to his gate, she said it so plainly that for a moment the world outside the corral stopped being a world at all and became only the sound of her voice. "I need to make love. Don't move." The words landed in the dry air like a sudden rainfall. Strange, shocking, and impossibly intimate. And for a single breath, Tom Hale, who had not spoken kindness into another person's life in what seemed like forever, felt every old measure of his own loneliness tighten like a rope. He could have slammed the gate and told her to go away. Men in his part of the country had a dozen ways to say no: a head shake, a lifted hat, a wall of silence. He could have reached for the old practiced hardness that had kept him sitting at his table alone for 3 winters and 2 summers. He was, by most accounts, a reasonable man who minded his own, and the town had learned to leave him alone after his wife's fever took her 5 years ago. But something in the way the woman's hands trembled as she said it, the way her body bent as if she found it painful to use the small voice she had, made him keep his feet where they were. She was more than a woman, at least in the way people use the word when they mean a presence too large for the landscape. The sorrow of her face was vast, her shoulders were broad, her hands were huge and calloused. She carried no hat to hide her hair, which hung in a waterfall of black. The barn door looked small beside her. Children in the village, when they dared to speak of her at all, called her the giant widow. The town's paper had once run a gossip piece about the woman in the folds of the mesa, and the headline had been made into a joke by men who drank too much and thought themselves wise. But Tom had never read the paper when it came out. He did not go where gossip gathered. He had read the Bible his mother left once, to the point where the words were thin with his thumb. He had read the names of his wife in the ledger of the farm, next to everything they owned. He had measured days in sheep and fence posts. He had rarely needed much more than his own quiet. She had come in the late afternoon, when the light first softened and the wind turned warm. Her eyes were the color of riverstone. They held him with a steadiness that was not impertinent so much as the weight of someone who had decided how she would meet the world and then did it without bowing. "Please," she said, "I cannot keep walking in circles. People stare. Men think I come to take from them. I don't want to frighten them. I need to make love. Don't move." Tom's first, most honest thought, the one that rose like something animal and immediate, was that she was a troublemaker. His second thought was that she was brave. He kept himself very still and let his voice be the one of a man who had long practiced neither bravado nor flirtation. "You mean stay here?" he asked. "On my property?" She peered at him, and for the first time he saw the rawness under the quiet. "I mean you," she said. "I have been lonely in a town that makes a plaything of me, or a myth. My husband is gone. He was taken in the flood. His voice is gone from my ears. I have hands that want to hold, and a heart that aches. I have nowhere that answers like your place did to the wind," I thought. Perhaps, if I said plain words, somebody would meet me. There it was, a human plea wrapped in bluntness. It was not the seduction of a young woman. It was the honest demand of someone who had been left, suddenly and wholly, unmoored. Tom felt then a flicker of recognition so old it was larger than memory, the ache of a life stripped of its other half. He thought of Maggie at the kitchen window, of the dress she'd left hanging on the back of a chair, of the quiet way she hummed when she shelled peas. He thought of how the house had held both their footprints and how, after she was gone, room upon room kept returning to him as if to ask him to look for her. He could have told her no then. He could have sent her to the small house near the crossroads where the town's poor lodged on winter nights. Instead, he opened the gate and held it for her, which felt like a kindness so small it almost made him blush. She stepped through, the earth seeming to bend under her weight, and when she was inside, she sat on the low step as a child might, knees pulled to chest, the movement awkward on someone built so large. For a long while, they only sat and watched the sheep pick their way among the clover. The sky was a great blue bowl. The silence between them became a kind of conversation. "You could stay in the barn," Tom offered finally, because he wanted to be practical. "We keep the loft clean in case of a storm." She shook her head. "I am not ashamed of my size," she said quietly. and the words were as much a shield as a confession. I am ashamed of the way people picture me and not of themselves. I thought if I put my need in the open, the world might not twist it into a story I do not want a story. I want a touch that says I am still of worth. The phrase make love should have been a literal one, perhaps a request for intimacy. But in her mouth it seemed to mean something older. Not the particular, but the general. The need to be known, to be held in a way that said one was seen and not merely observed. Tom found, when he let himself look, that his own needs matched hers like broken halves of a plate. He had never been good with words, but he knew how to make meals and mend fences. He had hands that worked. He had steady eyes. He could offer things that were not words but might matter in the quiet. You can sleep in the small room by the kitchen, he said. I will make a bed. She gave him a smile then, small and surprised, a thing shy of joy. You will not run like the others? She asked. I'm not others, Tom said. And it came out rough as a stone but true, so she stayed. At first their days followed a new cautious choreography. She minded the animals in a way she had done all her life. When the sheep lambed, her arms were the ones the lambs trusted. When fences fell, she lifted posts as if they were matchsticks. She cooked in the wide iron pot that had belonged to Tom's mother and cut bread into generous pieces. Tom watched her. Neighbors watched too, sometimes from a distance and sometimes from the window of the general store. Where rumor was made and sharpened into opinion, the children loved her. They liked the way she told stories with her hands, making mountains and valleys and flour on the table. They were unafraid because children see more clearly the substance behind the legend, but the town was not ready to make room for anything that upset the neat stories it liked to tell. Men muttered as they passed. Women crossed the street. The preacher offered prayers that sounded less like compassion than like a cold hand on a feverish brow. She will bring trouble, someone said, and the sentence became a shadow Tom had not invited into his yard. One Sunday, a group of men came by with the kind of solemn, bureaucratic anger that waxes in packs. Her people, they said, as if she were representative of an entire world they were pleased to exclude. They called her names that stuck to the air like burrs, and they spoke about property and decency as if the two were the only things a man must pay heed to. The ringleader, a man named Porter who ran the feed store, made a show of his concern. You're hosting her, he told Tom. You're asking for the town to look at us oddly. Think of your reputation. Tom looked at Porter and felt, for the first time since his wife died, the blood rise in his throat like some old warmth. He thought about the nights he had spent alone, in the empty space beside him, talking to no one, and he thought about the way the giant widow's laughter had come to sound like a new instrument in his kitchen. She's not a trouble, he said. She's a person. Porter scowled. You don't know what she wants. She said strange things. She speaks of making love that is indecent. Tom felt anger then, but more than anger, a deep, strange sorrow. The town would rather believe in tales than see the human truth at their feet. He could have let his pride move him to fight Porter. Instead, he did something that without thinking would later be called by neighbors foolish and by others nobility. He went to the edge of the yard, called for the men to come, and invited them in. Sit, he said. Eat. They sat, suspicious at first, but the giant widow moved among them as if the world were a place she expected to belong to. She ladled stew in the old, rusty ways of hospitality. Bread shared, ale poured, jokes told in low voices, did what ceremonies often do. They softened edges by the time the sun went down. Porter had a softened care in his eyes. Not entirely melted, but less hard. The men left talking in softer tones. The town did not change overnight. Then the twist came, not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, inevitable unfolding, like the way a plant grows toward light. Tom fell in love. It would be misleading to call it sudden. It was not the kind of fire that comes with dramatic gestures and stolen nights. It came in the small ways, the way she hummed while mending a blanket, the way her huge fingers could coax a stubborn foal to relax. He loved the way she fell asleep laughing sometimes, a sound like a bird trapped in cotton. He loved the gentle, unaware way she tucked his old boots in when they came in muddy, the way she knew without being told where his heart ached. He loved the honest bluntness with which she addressed him when he tried to be clever. Love in their case was not a theft, but a mutual settlement into being. It was surprising, and it made the world feel clean and new. One evening, as rain threatened and the storm-bellied clouds made the ranch look like a painting about to be smudged, she turned to him after supper and said quietly, "You remember Maggie?" He did. He remembered the day she'd slipped out of the world as if into a sleep and had not come back. He felt the familiar fissure open and then close. "I do," he said. "I think of her," she said, "not to take from you, only to know how love stays, even when someone is gone. I asked for one thing plain as linen. To be held, you never answered as I thought you might. You answered by making a place. You fed me. You kept me when the town would not. You gave me a home that is love too, Tom Hale." He could have told her then everything. The raw ache that had made him close off, the fear that any new attachment would be swallowed by loss. But his confessions were the kind that came in actions, not in long speeches. He took her hand, which was large and strong, and folded it over his own. "I did not know how," he said, "but I'm learning." The town, meanwhile, had not learned. Afraid of cruelty came one cold morning when a stranger rode into town with a wagon carrying gossip and a little money. He claimed to be a man of business, scouting for land that might feed newcomers. But the real business was curiosity. The real commerce was spectacle. He had heard of the giant widow, and curiosity is a force that will sometimes do what greed cannot. It will make people cruel to what they do not understand just to feel themselves part of something. A crowd gathered by Tom's fence, and their faces had the look of people watching a play where the tragic heroine would die for their entertainment. The stranger made a show of offering $200 for the right to display the woman in his caravan for a week in the neighboring town, promising that her oddness would bring fame to the area. Some people laughed. Others pleaded with Tom to sell. "We could use the money," someone said, with the simple, practical hunger that never felt as cold as malice but resulted in the same thing. "I will not sell her," said Tom, and the sound was quiet but final. He felt a weight in his chest, not pride but something like a vow. The giant widow's face had gone pale. It took him a moment to notice that she had been listening, that she had heard the talk. He came to her then and put his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that was ordinary and human and entirely unshowy. "You belong here," he said. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Some cheered Tom, following the half-formed instinct to praise a man who protected his own. But Porter, who had once considered him a reasonable sort, stepped forward with a different polished anger. "Tom," he said, "you're making enemies. The town will not stand for this forever. People get nervous." Tom, whose nerves had been a lonely geography for years, felt a dread settle like frost. He thought of the giant widow's hands and the way she carried herself with dignity, even when the world bent its head to rumors. He thought of how Maggie would have hated the notion of selling a human being as if they were cattle. He listened to the world then and decided that sometimes protection should not be measured by how loudly one shouts, but by how stubbornly one stays. "Then let them be nervous," he said. "If protecting someone from being treated as a curiosity is a crime in this town, then I will be its criminal." There are moments in life where people choose a side not because the flint of principle is sharp and honed, but because the heart cannot bear to watch another human be humiliated. That is what Tom did. He stood steady as the barn and refused to bar the path to the woman who had asked for nothing more than to be seen. The consequence of that decision was slow. Doors slammed in their faces. There were whispered threats. Someone slashed the tires on Tom's wagon one night. They painted words on his barn that tasted like venom. But the giant widow had children in the town, not of blood, but of spirit. The children she had befriended collected kindling for his stove in winter and left pears on the windowsill in summer. A few women, when they saw the small mercies she placed in their lives, a mended apron, an honest ear, came around, drawn like birds to Seed Porter, who had been the very image of town authority, found himself one evening standing at Tom's kitchen door with a small bowl of stew in his hands. "A moment," he said, And then, in a voice less brittle than before, I brought this. I I was wrong. Not everyone came around. The rift in the town remained. There were dogged men who continued to throw stones. In one of those nights, when the world outside was mostly a line of guttered lamplight and distant wagon groans, trouble came in a different shape. A boy, maybe 12, named Eli, whose eyes always seemed too full of the amazement the world denies most adults, went missing. The town searched. They found his hat by the river and his footprints leading toward the old ravine, where the waters had, in the spring floods, taken a man, and then again in autumn had swallowed a horse. The river was a rumor of force. One day it sang, the next it devoured. In the ravine, the ground gave under her foot. No one would have been surprised if she had fallen, but she shifted, wrapped her great arms around a shape in the brush, and lifted. Eli was unconscious, but alive. The giant widow cradled him like a child and climbed back up the ravine, the muscles in her arms and legs working with a patient resolve that made the town's earlier judgments look petty and small. When she returned, including Eli under the blanket on the porch, her face was streaked with dirt, and the relief in her eyes made the rumor of her monstrousness evaporate into nothing. That night, the town's mood changed in a way that can only be described as a tilt. The men who had hurled stones found their hands empty and ashamed. The women who had shivered at the thought of her presence now left soup on the doorstep. Even Porter, who had his own history of regretting the hardness of his heart, stood at the edge of Tom's yard and spoke with a voice thick and genuine. You were right. It would have been tidy, perhaps, if love and goodness had then sat on the porch and removed themselves entirely from pain. But life demands complexity. The real shock came later, in the form of an old grief rediscovered and laid bare. One winter, while the world lay under a sheet of white and the cattle pressed nearer to the barn for warmth, the giant widow received a letter. It arrived in the mail like any other small rectangle. But when she opened it, her hands trembled, and a silence fell over the farm. The letter had come from a man in a town upriver, a man who had known her husband. He wrote of the flood that had taken many lives the summer her husband disappeared, and of a ring found tangled in driftwood. He wrote of a regret that had been years in gathering. He begged for a meeting. He spoke of papers, of a house that had been left unclaimed. He spoke finally of names. Tom watched as the color leached from the giant widow's face. She read and read again, tracing a name with a finger that shook. He had a brother, she said at last. A brother who promised to look for him, but never did. He wrote that perhaps the ring belonged to him. He wants to make things right. It was the sort of kindness one might hope for in a story. The truth of a loss revealed. A kind of delayed justice. But the town had learned to be complicated. Narratives seldom come wrapped in simple, happy endings. The man's letter stirred up a different kind of attention. People began to ask for recompense. They began to revisit old accusations. If the ring was real, they said, then perhaps the widow's family had rights to property, to land, to things the town had long considered free for the taking. The matter dragged through summer and fall, through legal petitions and petty resentments. Men who had once leaned on the notion of a mythical figure for cheap entertainment found their gossip turned to speculation about inheritance and entitlement. In the courtroom, under the unforgiving light of official scrutiny, the giant widow stood with Tom at her side. Her spokes of dignity were all she had, and she used them like a shield. The town's murmurs were sharp as barbed wire. The opposing counsel, a man with a jaw carved by practice, suggested that she was using the tragedy of her husband to manipulate the town. She says she loved this man, he said, and his voice carried the nasty implication that love could be currency. Tom had a choice in that room. He could remain quiet, let the law handle itself, or he could speak and speak plainly. The memory of Maggie sat like a small lamp in his chest, and it lit him without ceremony. He stood and told the court the truth of the person he had come to love, about the way she fed children, the way she tended to the animals, the way she had saved a boy from drowning. She is not charity, he said. She is not spectacle. She is human. If you measure a life by measure of pain, then you will not forgive so easily the wrongs you have done. The judge, a man who had seen more sorrow than most, listened. The law did its measured work. The ring, when tested, belonged to the man who had been lost in the flood. Paper and evidence followed. It did not make the grief return. It did not erase the past, but it gave the widow a kind of closure that made people murmur in a different way. Some finally admitted their earlier cruelty and apologized. Porter came by with an awkward, earnest bread, and the man in the feed store seemed smaller for his earlier bluster. The town, slowly and unevenly, began to stitch itself at the seams. In the middle of all this, love did what it always does. It kept showing up in the small and daily. The giant widow and Tom continued to live together. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic wedding. What they had was a steady companionship that deepened, like an old painting whose colors grew richer. When seen from a short distance, Tom learned the shape of her laughter. She learned the angle at which he liked his coffee. They shared chores and guarded one another's dreams and fears. Children sat around their table and told stories about how the big woman spun tales that smelled of cinnamon. The town kettle did not entirely stop boiling, but it simmered less often. The true climax came one spring when the river rose again heavier than anyone remembered. It swelled with snow melt and rain, and the tired incompetence of the earth to hold the water. The bridge near the crossroads, the same bridge that had claimed the man long ago, creaked under the pressure and threatened to collapse. Cars were stranded. Voices rose thinly in panic. Tom and the giant widow ran to the bridge, and when the board parted and a wagon nearly toppled, she threw herself on the line like a thing between disaster and people. She held the rope that tethered the wagon with a grip like iron. The world that used to be quick to judge her now watched with a different reverence. Her arms shone with strain. Tom joined in, his hands taking the slack where he could. The bridge trembled. Children screamed. People shouted orders that were barely coherent. For a minute, everything in the town held its breath, the way a heart will stop before beginning again. When the wagon came free, when the bridge held long enough for the worst to pass, when the townspeople saw what had happened, there was a different kind of shock, not of scandal, but of awe. They had already seen her feed and mend and save a boy, but saving many people in a single motion carved a figure into them who would be remembered not as myth, but as very real men who had once thought themselves small and prudent, now called her friend. Porter, wiping his eyes in a way men seldom allow themselves to do in public, gripped Tom's hand. "You did a good thing," he said. "You kept her." In the gentle aftermath, when the river turned placid and the earth cooled, Tom and the giant widow stood together on the porch and watched their neighbors haul boards and help one another. It was a scene ordinary as bread and profound as prayer. "You asked me to make love," the giant widow said that night, under a sky that had finally cleared. The words were the same ones that had knocked the kettle of Tom's life into motion. "You asked," she repeated, "for a thing you thought was a touch. You wanted someone to say yes." Tom looked at her, the woman who had come into his life like an unexpected season. "And you helped me remember Maggie," he said. "You did not take from me. You gave me away to someone new, and that is love." She smiled, a tired, true smile that had been earned in grief and given in return. "I thought love was the thing I had to demand so boldly," she said. "I thought I needed to take. But you showed me that to make love is often to make room. You fed my hunger by letting me be human." He thought of the boy they had saved, the bridge they had mended, the way the town had slowly shifted its weight to make space. A visitor might have called this conclusion simple, even trite. But those who live long enough know that the quiet settlements of the world are never simple. They are built of debts repaid, hands held, and choices that cost nothing and mean everything. Years later, when Tom's hair had gone the color of a winter dawn and the giant widow's hands had acquired the gentle architecture of age, they would sit on the same porch and watch new children play. People would come and go, and sometimes someone would bring a stranger and say, as if it were the most natural thing, "This is the farm where the woman used to be a myth." They would smile and invite the stranger in. They would feed him. They would tell stories that were not of monstrousness, but of ordinary courage. In the end, the story that mattered was not that a giant woman asked for something plain and strange and received it. The story that mattered was that two lonely people found in one another the capacity to repair what had been broken, and by doing so, taught a town to be itself a little less cruel. They showed, without sermonizing, that the smallest acts of kindness, a gate held open, a bowl of stew, a steady hand on a rope, are the building blocks of moral courage. If there is a lesson to be drawn and put in a wooden frame, it is this. Love is not always the flash of flame in a lover's eyes. Sometimes love is the patient choosing to make room, to shelter, to hold a leash as a wagon threatens to fall. Sometimes love is saying, with your life, that another human is worth more than your reputation. And sometimes when the world asks us to be small, the truest answer is to stand large enough to shelter another until they can stand on their own. Tom and the giant widow grew old together, with wounds and laughter and a house full of children who had known them as simply the people on the porch. The town forgave itself slowly, and in doing so forgave the whole clumsy business of being human. When at last one of them went first, as people will, the other did not collapse into despair, but carried the memory like a warm quilt. It is perhaps the final and quietest form of making love, to carry the person you have loved into every small action thereafter. Years after the first words were spoken over a gate, "I need to make love, don't move," the phrase had become, among the children who grew up playing beneath the cottonwoods, a shorthand for courage. It meant saying what you needed plainly and trusting someone to hear you. It meant letting the world see your shape. It meant being brave enough to ask for a kindness you could not make on your own. And in the end, when the town no longer told the story as a scandal, but as a lesson, people would pause and say, sometimes making love is asking boldly. Sometimes making love is answering with a sheltering hand. And the truest kind of love is the kind that asks nothing in return but the right to be human.